Welcome to this lesson on one of the three question types you'll see in the verbal section, critical reasonings, and the argumentation basics that go along with very many of the question tasks you'll see for these questions. So let's begin by just talking about identifying argument tasks. So broadly, approximately 85% of your critical reasoning questions in the verbal section are going to deal with argumentation in one way or another, and 15% are going to be those inference tasks, where you basically just have to find a statement that must be true based on the information provided, and almost function as a short and dense reading comprehension problem. Now, the argument tasks are always going to apply new information from the choices to the prompt. So if you've got to consider information as true and apply them to the information in the paragraph, you're looking at some version of an argument task. You'll also be able to note the words argument, conclusion, or any synonyms to possibly indicate that you're looking at an argument task. And there are numerous possible tasks affecting or addressing the conclusion when you're dealing with argumentation in the critical reasonings questions on the verbal section. Now, the strategic implications of these begin with the idea that you need to note the clues in the question stem to not only help identify your task, but possibly your main conclusion. If it says something like the plan, well, clearly I know that's my conclusion, is that the plan is going to succeed in some fashion. Or if it's asking about the increase in, musk ox attacks is likely to increase, you're like, well, that's my conclusion if I have it stated in the question. So always note and see if you've got a little bit more information in the question to help you identify not only the task, but also the main conclusion. You do have to limit yourself to a single reread of the question stem or the argument prompt at any time on the critical reasoning, because it's really easy to just keep rereading information and get lost in the density of some of these scenarios. And for that reason, if you cannot readily identify your question task or the main conclusion, you want to immediately move to eliminating and guessing in under 30 seconds. Critical reasoning questions, remember, are our primary guess and move on candidates if we're running behind on pace in the verbal section. They take a while, and we know that they're self-contained, so you don't have to worry about a critical reasoning prompt resurfacing later on in the section and having more information asked about it. So you can immediately just get to moving quickly through the elimination process if you're having any trouble understanding the prompt or what the question is asking. So our top four argument tasks are just going to be the most likely candidates for argument questions that you'll see in critical reasoning. First is going to be strengthen, second is going to be weaken, and they're basically going to be flip sides of the same coin. So sometimes you'll be asked to strengthen the likelihood of the conclusion, sometimes you'll be asked to weaken the likelihood of the conclusion. You'll also frequently see questions asking you to identify an assumption, so that's basically asking you to find something that must be true to believe whatever the conclusion ultimately is. And you'll also sometimes see questions asking you to identify a flaw, which is basically requiring you to consider the information presented and find something that makes the conclusion seem inherently unlikely. Now, there are some other ancillary argument tests that we'll mention briefly. They will ultimately require you to do a lot of the same things that we're talking about here, but they're going to include things like explain or paradox questions. So these are basically asking you to resolve a discrepancy or a contrast between the conclusion and whatever the evidence is. So you've got to find an unstated fact that relates this contradictory seeming conclusion to the facts that led to it. You'll also have evaluate question tasks where they're basically asking you to find information that would be helpful to determine whether the conclusion is valid. You'll have questions asking you to identify the bold-faced roles. So this is basically asking you to determine what roles the bold-faced information provide or play within the argument, or potentially multiple arguments, because they can sometimes involve two speakers. You'll also see points at issue, which are another type of question that can involve two speakers, where one is sometimes debating the other, or they're in some way contradicting each other, so you've got to determine what point may be creating the conflict. And then lastly is just going to be method of argument, which is kind of a cousin to the identifying bold-faced roles. You're just trying to abstractly articulate how the argument gets from the information it presents as fact to its ultimate conclusion. So now that we understand the question tasks, let's actually talk about the basis of all argumentation, which is going to be the argumentation equation. Now, all arguments will ultimately lead to a conclusion, and your conclusion is simply going to be your explicit subjective opinion requiring some sort of support. So it's some statement that's made in the argument that you don't believe without some sort of reasoning, and that comes from what is known as your premise. And your premise is your explicit set of objective facts that provide support. So both the premise and the conclusion are stated in the prompt. You shouldn't have to guess, and you shouldn't have to paraphrase. Really avoid paraphrasing if you can. But between the premise and the conclusion is always going to be your assumption. And your assumption is implicit, but these are the unstated facts that must be true to provide the link between your subjective conclusion and your objective supporting premise. Now, there are some technical synonyms that you'll see and want to be familiar with for both premise and conclusion. So for premises, these can be grounds or evidence or reasoning or even the word support, as you see up there. These are just the facts that underpin whatever the conclusion is. And your conclusion is synonymous with claim or opinion or prediction or recommendation or position or hypothesis or even argument. It's basically, again, the subjective statement. That's how you need to think of your conclusion. So now let's talk about just how you identify conclusions in the abstract. So first you want to eliminate any clear statements of fact as possible conclusions, because if it's clearly a statement of fact, meaning that it's presented as objective and not requiring any excess interpretation, it can't be a conclusion. Your job with critical reasoning on the GMAT is not to debate the facts. It's not to debate whether there have been 25,000 brontosaurus fossils that have been found or 22,000 that have been found. That is not going to be the point at issue, so you can just accept facts as presented. Additionally, no specific outside knowledge should ever be required to evaluate your facts. You are not expected to be an archaeologist, for instance, when we're talking about those brontosauruses. Instead, you just have to rely explicitly on what is the information that's provided. Now, there are some bits of universal knowledge that may need to be applied, things that are truly global in their impact. So knowing things like the Earth has a single moon, or that when you freeze water, it becomes ice. Only those types of universal knowledge and the explicit statements from the prompt can be applied to the scenario and to the conclusion. And usually, at most, two statements are going to be possibly subjective and possibly not facts. So when you get down to two, you're going to consider them basically as your abstract statements A and B. And whichever is going to require support is ultimately going to be your conclusion. So you'll want to evaluate the relationship between these two remaining non-fact or clearly non-factual statements and see which one is providing and which one is requiring support. So if statement A supports statement B is the conclusion. Again, B is the one requiring the support. If statement B, however, supported statement A, then statement A is the conclusion because it is the one requiring support. So this is your basic conclusion test. If you're struggling to identify the conclusion, in most cases on the GMAT, this will not be required. It's honestly more relevant to like the LSAT for law school logical reasoning, but in case you need to differentiate between two somewhat seemingly subjective claims, here's how you can consider your conclusion test. So then let's try it out here with this example. So we've got our local official who says that for many years in Yamhill, bears were a constant presence in neighborhood yards. Then Bill moved in and the number of bear sightings dropped precipitously throughout Yamhill. Bill supposed he might be driving the bears away, but city records will promptly show a likely cause other than Bill. So we immediately can eliminate clear statements of fact as potential conclusions. So bear presence in Yamhill for many years, that's a fact. We don't have to debate whether the local official is right about there having been a constant presence of bears in Yamhill. Similarly, we know Bill moved in, he arrived, and bear sightings dropped. That's a fact. We're not going to attack these statements of truth, ultimately. So then we have to consider the two remaining statements in that final sentence, that Bill supposed he might be driving the bears away, and that city records will promptly show a likely cause other than Bill. So first we consider the Bill supposed part. So Bill supposed he might be driving bears away. That's just presented as a fact by the local official. It's not the local official supposing Bill was driving the bears away. It's just stating what Bill thought. And it's not supported by the rest of the sentence. So we can pretty much quickly eliminate that as our possible conclusion. And the only reason we might consider it is because our actual conclusion seems a little counterintuitive. Because while a cause likely other than Bill is a contrast, it is supported by the city records and is therefore the main conclusion. So the idea that there's a likely cause other than Bill is supported by the city records, and that is our ultimate conclusion. Now, as far as assumptions go, they have to be true to believe your conclusion based on the facts. So they're implied, as we said, but never stated in the prompt. And they have to be true in order for the conclusion to be logically sound. And there's also a test that we can use for identifying assumptions. It's called the negation test. So step 1 is to eliminate as many choices as possible for common wrong argument answer reasons, the ones that we talked about in our first critical reasoning lesson. Then you're going to take a remaining choice and negate its impact by using either an opposite quantity or adding or removing the word not from the main verb. Basically, you're just trying to turn it into the opposite. And then you're going to apply that information. And if the argument fails, you want to select your answer choice as your necessary assumption. Because if you took it away and the argument fails, then it was needed logically in the first place. So let's take a look at this negation test as it pertains to a sample assumption task from this local official's argument. So we've already read the argument, and the question is just asking which of the following is assumed by the local official's argument. So step 1 is to eliminate those choices for the common wrong argument reasons, so vague impacts, reverse impacts, additional information needed, or no impact whether true or false. So choice A, we see Bill is incapable of driving away large animals himself. And we know that it's something that must be true, and it seems like he's thinking that he's driving the bears away, and we want to show that it's something other than Bill, so it seems like this might actually be relevant. So we'll hold on to choice A for now. But then we move to choice B, and we see Yam Hill is home to many species of bear. We have not discussed bear species at all. We suddenly need a whole lot more information to consider this, so we'll just X out choice B pretty quickly. Then we've got Yam Hill City Archives are presently available for official inquiries. So here, it may seem quote-unquote out of scope, but we see we've got a local official who's giving the argument ultimately, and we talked about city records, so we'll hold on to C as well. Now, choice D, Bill's neighborhood has many bear lovers. Well, whether people love or don't love bears, that has nothing to do with what made the bears go away. So, at least not explicitly. So we can eliminate choice D for, again, requiring additional information, because you're like, well, does that mean we do have other causes? I mean, are the bear lovers, like, trying to take them to forests? I don't know. Creates more questions than answers, so eliminate D. Same thing with choice E, because this just says the local official is an accomplished hunter. Okay, is he a bear hunter? I don't know. Again, more questions raised than answered. So we eliminate eliminate E as well as B and D, and we're down to basically the two where we can apply our negation test. So we begin by just taking the first remaining choice and negating the impact by adding or removing not from the main verb, or in this case, we can basically just remove the word or the part of incapable in and just make it capable for the opposite. So choice A becomes Bill is capable of driving away large mammals himself. So if Bill is capable of driving away large mammals himself, it doesn't absolutely show that there isn't another cause besides Bill, because if we apply that to the conclusion, it just produces a negated vague impact, because you're like, okay, he's capable of driving the bears away, because they are mammals, but do we know that he did? No, there's absolutely could still be another cause. So choice A, we can eliminate for having a negated no impact. So we'll eliminate choice A, or negated vague impact, one or the other. Then, however, with choice C, though, if we negate that, it becomes Yam Hill City Archives are not presently available for official inquiries. And we know that it was city records that were supposed to promptly show a likely cause other than Bill. which, if we can't access the city records, they can't show a likely cause other than Bill. So even though this, at the outset, may have seemed somewhat quote-unquote out of scope or irrelevant, it is absolutely needed because choice C creates a negated fail. If the archives are not presently available, we don't believe that city records will promptly show a likely cause other than Bill because we couldn't access those records and the argument completely fails. So, those are the basics of argumentation for critical reasoning questions. Let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of examples on the whiteboard as well to apply these concepts in questions you might see on the official GMAT exam. Alright, so let's take a look at this first sample question. As always, with critical reasoning, we begin by just writing out the choices A through E, and we skip to the end to figure out what we're being asked to do. And in this case, we see the term argument, so we know we're dealing with an argument question task, and the word undermines is basically just a synonym for weaken. So we want to weaken this economist's argument. So now we're going to go ahead and read through the paragraph and try to identify the conclusion, because that's the next step. So we start, despite tremendous potential resulting from Brazil's natural endowments and untapped land, several important factors are likely to slow agricultural expansion. So right now, we may think to ourselves, that kind of seems like a fact, but kind of doesn't. So that might be our conclusion. So we'll hold on to that for now as a possible main conclusion for the economist's argument, and just see if everything else is a objective fact. So much of the country's available farmland is in areas that lack ready access to transportation infrastructure. So this right here, even though we wouldn't be able to annotate, I know that this is a fact, and we'll just say that's an F. Meanwhile, increasing demands for transportation, storage, and port infrastructure and capacity will likely outpace supply for quite some time, despite continuing government efforts in this area. So this, again, seems like it might be a subjective statement. So we need to consider, if we're looking at statement 2 and statement 1, which supports the other. So, despite tremendous potential resulting from Brazil's natural endowments and untapped land, several important factors are likely to slow agriculture expansion. Does this support the idea that increasing demands for transportation, storage, and port infrastructure and capacity will outpace supply for quite some time? It doesn't seem so, right? Like, all of these seem like the factors. And if these seem like the factors, then statement 1 requires the support, so statement 2 is providing the support. And so that means that statement 1 is the main conclusion, using our conclusion test. And now that we've got our conclusion identified, we know we're supposed to weaken. So, since the conclusion is that several important factors are likely to slow agricultural expansion, if we're just doing a basic prediction from the task of weakening, we want to find info to show that, we'll just call it ag exp for expansion, not slowed. And we have to consider each of the answer choices as true in order to see that the agricultural expansion is not necessarily going to slow down. So we start going through the choices, looking at each of them, trying to find a common wrong reason to eliminate. So urban transportation networks have been an unfulfilled Brazilian political priority for many years. Well, we're talking about agricultural expansion. We do talk about transportation, storage, and port infrastructure, but we don't actually talk about urban at all. So this requires additional information. Because you're like, well, I don't know if that actually means urban when we're talking about the ports and transportation and storage. And anything that's open to interpretation, I can basically eliminate as not clearly affecting the argument the way it should. Now, Available farmland is a prized resource for many countries reliant upon agricultural production. Well, if we're looking at many countries, well, we're just talking about Brazil. So whether it's many countries or not, this one we can eliminate for a true no impact because we only care about Brazil in this conclusion. Both Brazilian agricultural exports and imports rely extensively upon land-based and seafaring transportation networks. Well, we're talking about agricultural expansion, but we don't know anything about exports or imports. So again, this specifically would require more additional information to determine how exports and imports relate to this idea of agricultural expansion. So we can eliminate choice C as well. Choice D says that private infrastructure investment in Brazil is expected to soon eclipse similar public investment by several magnitudes of scale. So, in the abstract, this seems potentially to be irrelevant, but right now we know that we're outpacing supply despite government efforts. So if private infrastructure investment comes in, that could be a reason to support the idea that the agricultural expansion may not be slowed, because we have private investment, basically private dollars, for investment. And if we get the investment, then we don't necessarily have the slowing of agricultural expansion that was referenced. So this provides basically opposing support to the economist's conclusion, against the economist's conclusion, so we can hold on to that as a possible answer. And then choice E, the natural farming endowments endemic to Brazil are found in similar quantities in several other South American nations. Well, once again, we're not concerned with other South American nations based solely on this conclusion. So we can eliminate choice E as having no impact on the explicit argument, and select choice D as being the answer choice that best shows the conclusion that we identified through the conclusion test as not necessarily likely. So let's scroll on down and we'll take a look at another example from an art critic. And just as we did before, we're going to begin by writing out our answer choices A, B, C, D, E, and put a line over top so that we can identify our argument question task. So once again, we see the word argument, which tells me that it's probably an argument question task. And in this case, we've got the word assumed. So assumed is indicating it's an assumption question task. So we've got to find something that must be true to believe the conclusion. So we just started at the beginning, reading the art critic's argument, and we see while traditional art derives much of its strength and eloquence from local sources, most cultural funding programs have historically favored artists who come from somewhere else and have concentrated on delivering artistic resources or assets to communities from outside. So what the programs have done, that's just a fact. So this is not presented as the art critic's opinion. It's just background information, and that's just fact one, basically. Certainly, such approaches are not made with bad intent, but their rigid application makes funders and policymakers blind to the artistic traditions that are of, by, and for a local community, and this certainly seems like a rather subjective conclusion. So we'll just identify that as the conclusion, and you can see oftentimes you're not going to need to do the conclusion test. If there's no ambiguity as to what the opinion is, just go straight to it. So our assumption from a prediction standpoint is just going to be what must be to believe that those funders, and we'll just call them PMs for policymakers, are blind to local art traditions. So we've got this all set up, and now we've got to go find an answer choice that has to be 100% true in order to believe this conclusion. So first, we begin with A. Traditional local art is more dependent on outside resources than are other more established artistic endeavors. So, maybe, right? It seems like we're talking about resources, we're talking about local art, so if we're working through the process of elimination, I might hold the A with a squiggle and just go, kind of. Now, B, local artistic traditions and programs are not frequently uncritically adopted or otherwise supported by remote patronage. Wow, double negative. Frequently, this is the kind of question or answer choice that just baffles as you read it. So, allow yourself to use the question mark and just go, I don't really understand what's happening here. It's not a reason to eliminate, but I'm not a huge fan of this right now. Then, cultural funding programs often require extensive application processes, which are too time-consuming for underfunded artisans to complete. We finally have our first X. We're like, okay, whether or not they are extensive application processes and they're time-consuming, that has nothing to do with whether they're going to be, the funders are going to be blind to the local art tradition. So whether this is true or false, we can say this has no impact on the argument. The rigidity of approach required by outside funders of the arts is justified by limiting wasteful appropriation of tax dollars. We don't care whether there's a justification. So that is a good reason to eliminate here. You're just like, I don't need it to be justified or not. So again, we can eliminate that for having no impact on the argument. And then lastly, recent public polls have shown that funding traditional local artists is not a priority for most modern communities. Well, whether it is or is not a priority for the community has nothing to do with the funders or the policymakers. So we can just talk about these modern communities and say, well, the modern communities, that is not a specific impact. Or, worst case scenario, it requires additional information in order to determine the specific impact. So then we look back at choice A and choice B and we apply the negation test. So starting with choice A, we just come in and say traditional local art is not more dependent on outside resources than are other more established artistic endeavors. And you go, okay, traditional local art, it's not more dependent on these funders. But whether or not it's dependent on these things doesn't impact whether these people who fund the local art traditions are blind, or fund the local art programs are blind to the art traditions of the locality. So this would be a negated no impact, because you're like, okay, well, that doesn't mean that the argument fails. So that leaves us with the curiously phrased choice B, and oftentimes the best negation tests are the ones where you could just get rid of that double negative. So if we say that local artistic traditions and programs are frequently uncritically adopted or otherwise supported by remote patronage, well, remote patronage would be those outside funders. And if these local traditions and programs are uncritically adopted on a frequent basis, they're not blind to the local art traditions, they're actually supporting them. So through the negation test, we find a negated fail, which means that choice B has to be the correct answer, because when we took away choice B and made it untrue, the argument failed, meaning that it had to be the original assumption. So go ahead and apply some of these basic argumentation techniques on your own critical reasoning practice with some GMAT problems.